Hi, everyone. Well, we have our final notes of the year, and I'm going to try to go fairly quickly through these. There's a lot of content to get to. And also, I'm recording these on one of the half days. So I only have 30 minutes to get it done. So you guys want less notes? I only have a certain amount of time. So we'll try to get it done as quickly as we can. These notes are basically going to cover the 1990s up through the Trump administration. Don't talk a lot about the Biden administration because it's still happening as we speak. The Bill Clinton administration, Clinton is president from 1993 until 2001. He's elected twice in 1992 and 1996. And we're entering into an era of pretty divided politics in our country. Now, the map that you see there for 1992 shows some strange divisions. It's starting to look like our electoral maps with a solidly Republican South, pretty Republican middle of the country, although we got this like blue run through the middle here, and Democratic Northeast and West Coast. Now, the reason why this map looks a little different is because Clinton is actually from Arkansas. And so that's why we have some of these southern states that are pretty reliably Republican now that are going for Clinton. We also see this big chunk right here in the popular vote that is going for a third-party candidate, and that is Ross Perot. Ross Perot is a Texas businessman, and he is running as an independent. He's taken a lot of votes from George H.W. Bush, who is running against Bill Clinton as the Republican candidate. Clinton wins. Pretty divided election. He wins with less than 50% of the popular vote, but a pretty solid majority of the electoral vote. And Clinton is going to style himself as a new Democrat. And basically, he is going to be a moderate. He is not going to be of the relatively far left leaning candidates that we saw, like, LBJ, JFK, like hard New Deal Democrats. Clinton is going to try to chart a new path for the Democratic Party. He is going to focus on the economy and specifically balancing the budget, which he is fairly successful at doing. He is going to cut taxes, decrease spending, increase the federal surplus, and lower the debt. Again, this is very different than what Democratic presidents were focused on post-FDR. Democratic presidents were not really concerned about the deficit. They were not really concerned about cutting taxes. Clinton is president during a pretty conservative time in American history, and his focus on the economy reflects those conservative values. What Clinton is most remembered for these days is his impeachment. Clinton is the first president since Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction in the 1860s to be impeached. And he is impeached between 1998 and 1999 during the investigation into sexual harassment claims, which were made by Paula Jones. During the investigation about those allegations, it came out that Clinton had an affair with a White House staffer, White House intern, I should say, Monica Lewinsky, who is pictured here. And he lied about that affair. And so he is charged with perjury and obstruction of justice. Perjury, lying under oath, obstruction of justice, getting in the way of an investigation. He is impeached, so he is brought to trial, essentially, by Congress, and he is acquitted of the charges. But he is acquitted in a mostly party line vote. Again, talking about the map that we see up here and the age that we're entering into, this is the modern divided country. And Clinton had the affair with Lewinsky. He has admitted as such at this point in history, and he lied under oath about it. So he did these things. I mean, he committed perjury and he obstructed justice. The question that was really in front of Congress was, to what extent should this mean he needs to be removed from office? And the majority of Congress people said he shouldn't be removed from office. So even though he did these things, it does not warrant removing him from office. So Clinton serves out the rest of his term and leaves office in 2001. The 1990s are economically remembered for a couple things. Clinton balancing the budget. It's really the last time that we've had a balanced budget in this country. But they're also remembered as a boom, a tech boom specifically. The 1990s, due to the technology sector, which is starting to ramp up in the 1980s, explodes in the 1990s. Computing, computer technology, the fact that computer technology, which had been around since the 1960s, really, is becoming more commonplace in American homes. It's becoming more affordable for average Americans. This is really driving the economy. The advent of the internet, of course, also the internet goes back, probably 1960s as well. I don't know exactly when it was invented, but it really comes into Americans' homes in a big way in the 1990s. My family, we got our first computer that was connected to the internet, I think, in 1995. And there are a lot of people, the first computer that they got was in the 1990s. It's sort of like the radio is the 1920s and television is the 1950s. The computer is the 1990s. It's sort of the 1980s as well. There are a lot of people who are getting computers in the 1980s, but really I would associate it with the 1990s. We also see during this time period the largest peacetime economic expansion in the history of the country, even bigger than the 1950s. So this is a really good time economically for the United States. But just like in the 1920s, another booming decade, how that's built on, to some extent, a house of cards, this is as well, and it's going to come crumbling down in the early 2000s to some extent, not like what we saw in the 1930s, obviously, but to some extent. Low unemployment, globalization, world trade is increasing. The United States is the global leader in economically. And so we are benefiting from this globalization. But as we talked about with the 1980s, the other thing that's happening is economic inequality is continuing to rise. I think we can best see that when we compare ourselves to the rest of the West, capital W, and we can see that economic inequality is rising across the board in the West, but it is rising at a much faster pace in the United States. So that by 2010, the top 1% holds somewhere around 43% of the nation's wealth, and it is even higher than that today in the early 2020s. Another thing that is accelerating throughout this era, 1980 to the present, we'll include the 1980s in it, is immigration. This immigration is coming mostly from our hemisphere, but also South and East Asia as well. By 2000, the Hispanic population was the fastest growing part of the fastest growing demographic in the United States. And a lot of this is due to the immigration reform of 1965. We've looked at immigration in this course a couple times, first in the 1920s, when those really strict quota acts are put in place. Those quota acts are repealed in 1965 with the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, and it creates the modern visa system. And the modern visa system, you can see, allows for the increase of immigration to the United States. Now, a part of what's also happening during this time period is illegal immigration is also increasing post-1980. The visa system that is created post-1965 limits the number of visas that are available. And there are different types of visas that you can get. You can get visas for education. You can get visas for your job, how highly skilled your job is, how in demand your job is. There's different types of visas, but they are limited. There's a set amount of visas that are available year to year. And what we've seen since the 1980s, it predates the 1980s, but since we're talking about this era, since the 1980s, there have been more people who have wanted to come to the United States than there are available slots. And so what that does is it drives illegal immigration, people who are trying to get to this country but are not able to do so through the legal channels. There have been a number of attempts to deal with illegal immigration. One of the first big ones is the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. Most recently, the creation of the border wall. This was Trump's primary goal, I think, in the election of 2016. It was basically the thing that he ran on, was the construction of a border wall for our southern border. Illegal immigration is still seen as a big problem in the country. Hard to say how many illegal immigrants are living in the country today because, of course, they are living here illegally. They don't want to be found. So that makes counting them difficult, but it's, 13 million, 15 million, something like that. Our country is debating all kinds of issues surrounding illegal immigration. What to do when illegal immigrants are identified, how to deport them. Some of these illegal immigrants have been living their whole lives in this country. For the most part, they were brought here when they were very young children, so they don't have a country to be deported to. There's all these issues surrounding illegal immigration. For APUSH, that's a little beyond our purview. We don't need to worry too much about that. What we do need to know is that immigration is increasing post 1980. It's increasing in terms of legal immigration. It's also increasing in terms of illegal immigration. Internal immigration is moving to the south and to the west. And this is a trend that is really a post-World War II trend, and it is still going on today. The growth of the Sun Belt we talked about post-World War II, and the growth of the Sun Belt is continuing during this era as well, 1980s, 1990s, on into the present. This has brought with it an increased political significance for the areas that you see here in red, most notably Florida, Texas, California, and also some of the swing states that we see here. Arizona is one of those swing states. North Carolina, the bottom half of North Carolina is kind of highlighted here, but like Raleigh, Durham, and the growth of that area. So there's a lot of significance here in terms of economic growth. There's a lot of job opportunities in these areas. There's a lot of companies that are moving here post-World War II, but also in terms of electoral politics. A lot of the Republican majorities that we see post-1980 are coming from the fact that Republican areas in the South are growing in terms of population. And so that's significant in a lot of the elections that we take a look at. Speaking of which, one of the most contentious elections that we see during this, certainly during this era, but really post-World War II, is the election of 2000. I don't want to belabor the point too much because it's not super important for APUSH, but it is an interesting election. The election pits George W. Bush, who is, of course, the son of George H.W. Bush, a Republican, against Al Gore, who was the Democratic vice president under Bill Clinton. Gore receives more popular vote, but you can see it is razor thin when you look at that. And the Electoral College is also razor thin. This is pretty much as close as you can get in an election. You need 270 votes to win. George W. Bush eventually ends up with 271. The really interesting thing about this election, though, is how it is decided. The vote in Florida is too close to call. And so we get to this point the day after the election, a few days after the election, where Florida is so close, 537 votes, that it triggers an automatic recount. And during that recount, it takes a lot of time. It takes over a month for this recount to be going on. And what happens during this recount is there are a lot of irregularities that are being uncovered. This is kind of what we see here in this goofy looking picture. One of the things that happens, to give you an example of what an irregularity looks like, is a lot of these voting machines, when they are punching, they're actually punching a literal card. When you go and you cast your vote, you like pull a lever and it actually punches a card. Well, some of these machines are not actually punching all the way through the card, and it creates what are called hanging chads. And these are like little dimples in the card that are actually not punched all the way through. And so the question becomes, what counts as a vote? So if the machine punches all the way through the card, obviously that's a vote. But what if the machine only depresses the card? How far does it need to depress the card for it to be considered a legitimate vote? You get into and you're talking about millions of votes. So you get into all of these questions, these existential questions. Eventually, Republicans sue to end the recount. They say this recount could go on forever because we're going to be litigating what actually constitutes a vote. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court hands the election to George W. Bush. Says, stop the recount. Bush is leading by a couple hundred votes. That's the way it's going to be. And so he is handed Florida, which gives him the election. You know, I mentioned in class a couple of weeks ago that a lot of Americans today in 2024 really see the Supreme Court as a partisan branch, just like the other two branches. And this court case has a role to play in that. The Supreme Court is seen by many Americans as a partisan part of the government because you have 5 conservative justices who are siding with the Republicans and saying the recount should stop. You have 4 liberal justices who are siding with the Democrats and saying allow the recount to go on. And so we have more Americans who are questioning their election process after the election of 2000, highly contentious election. So George W. Bush is handed the presidency. He is inaugurated in January of 2001. And 8 months later, one of the most important events of the last, the post-World War II era, I would argue, occurs. And you all have heard of this, which is September 11th, 2001, where a group of radical Islamic terrorists who are a part of a terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda, attack the World Trade Centers in New York. They attack the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and there is a 4th aircraft, which is also hijacked and crashes in rural western Pennsylvania. It's unclear what that aircraft was targeted towards. Best guesses are it was either the Capitol building or the White House. Thousands of Americans are killed in these attacks, and it empowers the George W. Bush administration to take action in the Middle East, specifically in 2 places. The first war is going to focus on Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the goal is to remove the Taliban, which is a radical Islamist government ruling over Afghanistan, from power. And the reason that the United States wants to remove the Taliban from power is that they have been allowing Al-Qaeda to operate out of the mountains of Afghanistan for some time. The Taliban ideologically was fairly aligned with Al-Qaeda, in some ways pretty anti-Western. And so the United States goes to Afghanistan, says we're going to remove the Taliban from power. While we're there, we're going to hunt down Al-Qaeda and destroy their organization. And then we are going to stay and rebuild Afghanistan and turn it into a functioning, vibrant democracy. More on that later. Another thing that happens in the immediate aftermath of September 11th is the passage of the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act greatly expands the powers of the United States government to gather intelligence. And what proponents of the bill will say is that that is what is necessary to protect the United States. The United States government has to be able to control the flow of information if it is to protect the United States from further domestic incidences of terrorism. And the United States government is going to do this by spying, basically, wiretapping phones, reading text messages, emails. The government is going to have greatly expanded powers in this regard. What opponents will say is that what the Patriot Act is doing is it is infringing upon civil liberties of American citizens. One of the themes that I try to talk to you guys about in APUSH is this constant tension in American history between freedom and security. And there is always a tension in any democracy between freedom and security. The more freedom you have, the less security you have. And the more security you have, the less freedom you have. That's just the way it is. And what we see after September 11th is the pendulum starts to swing more towards security and away from freedom. And you can understand why when you look at what happened on September 11th. Americans are very afraid and they value security. They do not want to get on an aircraft and worry that they are going to be crashed into the side of a building. And so you get the creation of the TSA. You get the implementation of full body scanners at airports. You have people taking their shoes off when they go through airport security. You have federal marshals who are flying on airplanes. These are all measures that are taken in order to make sure that another September 11th doesn't happen. And most Americans after September 11th say these are like common sense, logical steps to take. But you have to remember they come at the cost of freedom and civil liberties. This is not to say that they are bad. That's not the argument that I am making. The argument that I am making is simply that if you have more security, you inherently have less freedom. Creation of the Department of Homeland Security also is something that takes place after 2001. And that's because the agencies that are tasked with the protection of the United States are not doing a good job of sharing information and talking to each other. You have the US military, you have the FBI, you have the CIA, and they're all kind of operating on their own. They're not sharing information as well as they should be. At least that's what some in the government are claiming after September 11th, that, hey, the CIA knew about X, Y, or Z prior to September 11th, but they didn't share it with the FBI, or vice versa. So the creation of the Department of Homeland Security is supposed to try to be a bridge, really, between all of the different security apparatuses that exist in the United States. So I mentioned two wars. There were two wars. One was in Afghanistan, the other was in Iraq. And the war in Iraq was linked by the Bush administration to a global war on terror. What happens after September 11th is that the goal of the war on terror is very quickly redefined as being a mission against al-Qaeda to being a mission against global terrorism. And what we see is that even by early 2002, just a couple months after September 11th, the Bush administration is really focusing on three countries. Afghanistan, we go to Afghanistan in October of 2001, and pretty quickly the United States removes the Taliban from power and begins to hunt down al-Qaeda. But there are three other places in the world that the Bush administration is deeply concerned by, and they are Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And these three countries are labeled the axis of evil. And the Bush administration targets Iraq as the first of these countries to be dealt with. This is probably because Iraq is the easiest target. It is the most susceptible to an attack. It is the weakest country economically, militarily. It is also the country that George W. Bush has some history with. Of course, his father, 10 years earlier, 11 years earlier, had fought a war against Iraq to remove Iraq from Kuwait and had not removed Saddam Hussein from power. George W. Bush is going to attempt to do what his father did not do, which was to remove Saddam Hussein from power, the dictatorial leader of Iraq, and to find the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was supposedly building. There was a lot of fear in 2002 and early 2003 that Saddam Hussein was bent on creating chemical weapons, possibly nuclear weapons, and that was something that the George W. Bush administration said we cannot allow to occur. And so the outcome of the war, Saddam Hussein is removed from power. He is pretty quickly removed from power. He is eventually found, brought to trial, and executed by the Iraqi government, the government that is installed by the United States once we invade and remove Saddam Hussein from power. Those weapons of mass destruction, though, are never found, and it seems that they never existed. Iraq had been interested in acquiring weapons of mass destruction during their war with Iran in the 1980s, but they had dismantled them, what they had created in the 1990s. And in fact, it seems that Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction and was not really close to creating any weapons of mass destruction. The other outcome of the war in Iraq is that it really destabilized Iraq and destabilized the region as well. There is a democracy that is installed in Iraq, and that democracy still exists today to some extent. But it only exists in certain pockets, and it's fairly corrupt, weak, and ineffective. What this destabilization does is it creates fertile ground for the growth of ISIS. And ISIS is an organization, the Islamic State, which begins taking over huge chunks of territory in 2014. And for a time, in 2014, 2015, ISIS is probably the primary global concern of the West. It is a really terrifying development because of how rapidly ISIS is able to gain territory and expand. Um, the goal of ISIS is unlike something that had been seen in the modern world, because what ISIS is attempting to do is to create an Islamic caliphate. It is rejecting the modern political state system. It is a radical, fundamentalist political unit that believes the only legitimate political organization, form of political organization, is the Islamic Caliphate. Basically, a theocratic state, a religious state, with a caliph, an Islamic cleric, in charge. ISIS was able to control an area with over 12 million people living in its borders. And this is this gray area that you see here. It is northern Iraq and Syria. Now, Syria is experiencing a civil war. Iraq has been destabilized by the United States, which creates this power vacuum that ISIS is able to take advantage of. But very quickly, its territory declines. And that is because ISIS is enemies with everyone, because it rejects the idea of the modern political state. ISIS is not able to have allies. It is not able to enter into negotiations with other states which may have had some aligned interests with ISIS. ISIS is an enemy of everyone. And so because of that, I kind of look at ISIS as a very bright star. For a time in 2014, 15, early 16, ISIS was a very, very hot, bright star in the Middle East. But when you have very bright, very hot stars, they tend to burn out very quickly. And that was ISIS. It moved very rapidly, expanded very quickly, but it collapsed under its own weight also very quickly. And so that by 2016, it was falling apart pretty much daily. You could watch its territory evaporate. And so by 2017, it pretty much ceased to exist in terms of a territorial presence. Still continues to exist today, but it's a stateless actor, pretty much a stateless terrorist organization. So I'm going to pause there because I think the bell's about to ring. So why don't I pause there, and I'll do a part two in a few moments. This is good. We're like almost done. We're doing good. Oh, there's a bell. Perfect timing.